Here is a black ink by TWSBI Black.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
It's going to be important to point out that I was not having a especially good penmanship day as I was doing this, but it is what it is, so it's there. It would seem there isn't much that you can say about a black ink, especially when it performs the way you want a black ink to perform. There's no real tone variation by pen, just really line width, of course. Now, yes, you'll see the slightest difference when it goes on a very dry fine pen. There's no real shading either, at least on the papers that are the writing samples. Now, I'm taking my show notes on Tomoe River paper, and to be honest, there with the Parker Jotter, I am seeing some tone variation happening. That is a bit disappointing. So while it's not in the video, it is kind of important to point out. But this is a strong candidate as someone's go-to black ink. I think it really performs superb. If I didn't already have 3 different bottles of black inks that I really like using, I probably could see buying a bottle of this to go ahead and use. Plus, their bottles are very nice and not like everybody else's.
The pen for today is a Parker Jotter. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we still get a very nice black. It is the lightest version here, but it is definitely black and not gray. We get no feathering, we get no spread. Now, this is the closest to a shading we're going to get in the downstrokes where the lines get a bit thicker. It appears a bit darker. So if you wanted to call that shading, I wouldn't argue with you about it. It does show up when you see it on the word felt on the second line or heard on the third line. So I guess in the case of a dry, soft fine, you could say that it has some shading. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker-ish. No, I think it's the same, but if you were to say, I'm going to call it the same tone with no feathering, with no spread, with no shading. This is really perfect as I see black inks and want them. I tend to want my black inks to have nothing and just be there and bold on the page, and this is. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the wet fine nib. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is no shading, just glorious, solid black lines the entire way. Really excellent in what we're getting. I'm very happy with this. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone that we get with the medium. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. Again, nice, beautiful, thick, solid lines. Exactly what you want from a black ink. As I said in the very beginning, there's not a whole lot you can say about an ink when it performs perfectly the way you would want it to. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 8 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib. While I really see it as very much the same tone with just really an effect of the paper, I guess if you wanted to, you might call it slightly darker. I don't really think so. I think we're seeing the same tone just as a much thinner line. We get no feather, we get no spread. We get, if you wanted to call it shading, in areas where you lap back down, like on the L's of still, you get some darker letters with some lighter letters. You see it, I want to say, in suddenly, where the D's compared to the EN right next, the D's look just a little bit darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the soft fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. This performs very well on this paper that really always seems to perform well with fountain pen ink. This is one that people probably should pay a lot more attention to, the paper and the ink. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone that we got with the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. I'm going to give you just a minute so that you can see just a little bit of the writing, not really a minute, more of a couple of seconds, so that it doesn't become a nothing as a video, because this ink is really very nice. Looking at the broad nib, we get the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading, we get great lines on the, I don't want to say writing, because my writing is definitely off today. However, I think the performance we get on the page is standout on its own, very good. Looking at the back of the page, we do see that we get some minor ghosting. I think you may be able to write back here without any real problem. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get the same tone that we get with the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. We get a very nice looking ink on this paper. If this is going to have a tone change as a result of the paper, it tends to be here or later on with the lab notebooks. That one will be interesting to look at. Really great. Can't complain about this. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is the same tone as the soft fine, with no feathering, with no spread, with no shading. It is beautiful as a black ink, perfect in performance. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It has no feather, it has no spread, it has no shading. It performs really top notch. TWSBI has done such a good job in what is their first line of inks that they put out. Looking at the broad nib, we get the same tone as the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with no shading. Well done. Looking at the back of the page, we have no problem with ghosting. You can easily write on the back of this paper. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread, no shading. Beautiful. And, you know, this is a dry writing pen. So when it's really coming out the same, it really shows just how opaque this ink really is in what it's doing. Looking at the wet fine nib, we get the same tone as the soft fine, with no feathering, with no spread, with no shading. Not too bad. I just, again, I know I have to give a few seconds for you to be able to see more than the tiniest bit, but there's nothing you can really say about it when it does this well. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the soft, or as the wet fine. No feathering, no spread, no shading, beautiful solid black lines the whole way through. It feels nice under the nibs to write with. Some inks have that wetter feel or drier feel, and when they're a bit denser, which I think this is probably a denser ink, it tends to make nibs feel a little bit smoother, and this ink is doing that. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It has no feathering, it has no spread, it has no shading. It does have that smooth feeling to write underneath that I mentioned with the last writing sample. It's really, if I wanted to call it an extra feature of this ink, it's that it does make the nibs all feel a little bit smoother to write with, including that soft fine, which tends to have a bit more feedback. I enjoy the feedback, but this makes it feel even smoother. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Birmingham Pen Company Shady Sight Walnut Street Brown. Here is Diatramentis Nikola Tolstoy Khaki. Here is KWZ Honey. Here is Sailor Piano Mahogany. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little lighter and duller than it was on the Clairfontaine. Really an effect of this paper. It does tend to bring out any kind of imperfections that an ink can have in some of what happens with color. It's got kind of a faded black look to it. Now, there's no feather, there's no spread. Because it largely has that faded black look, then I would say that it is shading. You see it in have on the first line. The H is a bit darker, and it lightens up throughout, where those on the second line starts lighter, darkens up at the H, lightens up again as through the rest of the word. So while it is a decent black for students on this paper, I don't see this as being really a best option for a solid black, if that's what you're looking for on this paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a little lighter and flatter in tone than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread, no shading, so it's good solid black lines there. It's just it's the flatter tone. It's like a dusty black, I guess I would call it, which I don't encounter. I haven't really encountered, but I don't think I have nearly as many reviews on this paper as I do on some others from those first 3 years. I still think it's good. Don't think it's the best for a student with this. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. A little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, still giving that kind of dustier or flatter black look to it. Really matte in its color. No feather, no spread, no shading. In all of that, as a black, it is performing well. It is the way the black is coming across. It's less lively. Go back and look at it compared to the Clairfontaine. There is some difference. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium. Lighter than the Clairfontaine, with no feather, with no spread, with no shading. Here with the thicker lines, it is really noticeable how not dark a black it is on this paper, because I get to look at it side by side with the Clairfontaine. And because of that, I'm seeing it and saying, yeah, there's definitely a problem in what's there. And it's not the best. It's not horrible. It's not the end of the world, but it is not the best. Looking at the back of the page, the ghosting isn't really a problem. I think you could write back here without any issues. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a magenta ink by Krishna Wild Cherry. Here is a pink ink by J.R.R. Rose Cyclamon. Here is a yellow ink by Diatramentis Mahatma Gandhi Saffron. Here is a red ink by KWZ Red No. 1. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It feathers a lot. It spreads a fair amount. I don't want to say it's huge and out of control. I think the feathering is the biggest issue. The feathering would probably bother me in the downstrokes where it just doesn't look good. And so it's not like you can avoid the downstrokes in your writing. And I guess you could say it's shading, maybe. It's copy paper. It is darker than it was with, or it's the thicker lines are definitely making it look darker. I'm looking very closely right now. It's actually the same tone, but it's just that it's so much thicker because the feathering, like a beast, spread like a large beast. Shading, no, it doesn't shade. It definitely looks like there's black ink on the page. I would almost prefer to write with a Sharpie than this ink on this paper, but it's copy paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine nib. We get feathering, still beastly. We get spread, still large beastly. We get no shading. Thankfully, I guess, don't use this, it's gross. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. No, it's just that we get a lot less feathering than we had on the medium or the wet fine. The feathering is much more under control with this nib. The spread is much more under control with this nib. I'm kind of surprised by it, not as compared to the wet fine. I expected that to have the biggest issues. I think this incomparably, which one would I rather use, the soft fine or the broad? I think you could choose either and be aware of what your how it's going to look and not be horrified. Maybe, yeah, not be horrified. Looking at the page underneath, we see that the broad, the medium, the wet fine, but not the soft fine. The other three bled through, but not the soft fine. Their bleeding through wasn't huge and a major thing, but it did touch the page underneath. We can see why, looking at the back of the page, there's a lot of ghosting. You can't write back here. There is a very strong chance with the soft fine that you could write on the back of the page, though.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
This one's fairly easy, and if you've really made it this far, you know this is a dealer's choice. I just need to, ramble a little bit so you can see this on the yellow paper. At this point, it has obviously been a bad penmanship day for me, but at least I'm using my pens and writing, even though it's a bit frustrating. I just couldn't get into the right seated position for how the camera is, and I tend to not really talk about that, but I'm sure you've heard others do it. Sometimes a pain, even when the camera's well up high out of the way.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.